The afternoon sun was getting low as David turned his Honda Civic onto Maple Street. He had just finished visiting his grandmother at Sunset Gardens, the assisted living facility where she had been staying for the past 2 years. Every Tuesday he made this same drive to see her, bringing her favorite cookies and spending hours listening to her stories about the old days. David was tired. The basketball season had been demanding, with back-to-back games and endless travel. At 6 feet 8 inches tall, he always felt cramped in his small car, but he loved that Honda. It was the first car he had bought with his own money, back when he was just starting out in the league. Sure, he could afford something fancier now, but this car held memories. His grandmother had been with him when he picked it out from the used car lot 5 years ago. The neighborhood around Sunset Gardens was one of those places where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. Perfect lawns, expensive cars in every driveway, and streets so clean you could probably eat off them. David never felt uncomfortable here. After all, his grandmother lived here and he had every right to visit her. As he stopped at a red light, David noticed a police car in his rearview mirror. The officer behind the wheel seemed to be looking at him with more interest than usual. David didn't think much of it at first. Police officers were everywhere, and he had never had any trouble with the law. He was just a guy visiting his grandmother. The light turned green and David continued down the street. He needed to make one more turn to get back to the main road. His GPS was telling him to turn right in about 200 feet, but something made him look in his mirror again. The police car was still there, and now it seemed to be following a little too closely. Officer Bradley Mills had been patrolling this area for over 15 years. He knew every street, every house, and most of the people who lived here. When he saw the Honda Civic with the young man inside, something didn't sit right with him. This wasn't the kind of car you usually saw in this neighborhood. And the driver looked out of place too. Mills had his own way of thinking about things. In his mind, people belonged in certain places, and when they strayed from where they belonged, it usually meant trouble. He had seen it countless times before. Young guys driving through rich neighborhoods looking for opportunities that weren't theirs to take. The Honda made a right turn, and Mills decided to follow. He watched as the car moved slowly down the street, as if the driver was looking for something. Or maybe looking for someone who wasn't home so he could check out their property. Mills had seen this behavior before, and he wasn't going to let it slide on his watch. David was simply following his GPS, but he noticed the police car had made the same turn. Now he was starting to feel a little nervous. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but there was something about being followed by a police officer that made anyone uncomfortable. He kept his speed exactly at the limit and made sure to use his turn signals for every movement. As David approached the next intersection, he saw the flashing lights come on behind him. His heart sank. He had no idea what he could have done wrong. He had been driving carefully, following all the traffic rules, and he hadn't been speeding. But there was no point in wondering about it now. He needed to pull over. David found a safe spot along the curb and turned off his engine. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, just like his father had taught him years ago. His father had given him the talk about dealing with police officers when he was just 16. Stay calm, be respectful, keep your hands where they can see them, and don't make any sudden movements. Officer Mills got out of his patrol car and walked toward the Honda. He took his time, looking around the neighborhood as if he was making sure everyone could see him doing his job. Mills had a certain way of walking when he was on duty, a swagger that let everyone know he was in charge. As Mills approached the driver's side window, David rolled it down and waited. The officer was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious expression. He looked like he had been doing this job for a long time, and he looked like he wasn't in a particularly good mood. "License and registration," Mills said. Without any greeting or explanation for the stop, David reached slowly into his glove compartment for his registration and then for his wallet. "Officer, can I ask why you pulled me over?" he said politely. Mills looked at David with suspicion. "I'll ask the questions here. What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The question caught David off guard. He had never been asked that before during a traffic stop. "I was visiting my grandmother at Sunset Gardens," he said. "She lives in the assisted living facility about a mile back." Mills took David's license and registration, but didn't seem satisfied with the answer. "Sunset Gardens, huh? That's a pretty expensive place. What's your grandmother's name?" David felt confused by the line of questioning. Why did it matter what his grandmother's name was? And why did the officer seem so suspicious about him visiting a family member? Her name is Dorothy Williams, David said. She's been living there for 2 years. Mills studied the license for a long moment. The name on it was David Williams, and the address was from across town, in a much different neighborhood than this one. David Williams, Mills said slowly. And what do you do for work, David? I'm a professional basketball player, David answered honestly. Mills let out a small laugh. Right, and I'm the mayor. You got any proof of that? David felt his face getting warm. This was getting strange very quickly. Officer, I'm not sure why that matters. I was just visiting my grandmother, and now I'm heading home. I haven't broken any traffic laws, but Mills was just getting started. He handed David back his license and registration, but he didn't walk away. Instead, he leaned down closer to the window. Step out of the vehicle, he said. David's heart started beating faster. Is there a problem, officer? I said step out of the vehicle. Now. David had no choice but to comply. He opened his door slowly and got out of the car. As soon as he stood up to his full height, he could see that he towered over the officer. Mills seemed a little surprised by David's size, but he didn't back down. Turn around and put your hands on the car, Mills ordered. David did as he was told, but he was getting more confused and worried by the minute. Officer, I really don't understand what's happening here. I was just visiting my grandmother. Mills began searching David's pockets. We'll see about that. I've been working this neighborhood for 15 years, and I know when something doesn't add up. As Mills continued his search, a few people in the neighborhood began to notice what was happening. A woman walking her dog slowed down to watch. A man getting his mail stayed by his mailbox longer than necessary. This was the kind of neighborhood where people notice things, and a police stop was definitely something worth noticing. David stood there with his hands on his car, feeling embarrassed and confused. He had done nothing wrong, but somehow he had become the center of attention in this quiet neighborhood. All he had wanted to do was visit his grandmother and go home. Now he was being treated like a criminal, and he had no idea why. The whole situation felt wrong, but David knew he had to stay calm and cooperate. He just hoped it would be over soon. Officer Mills finished searching David's pockets and found nothing suspicious, just a wallet, some keys, and a phone. But instead of ending the stop there, Mills seemed to be getting more interested in the situation. He walked around David's Honda, looking through the windows as if he expected to find something incriminating. So you say you're a basketball player, Mills said, his voice dripping with disbelief. What team? David was still standing with his hands on the car, feeling more uncomfortable by the minute. The Thunder, he said, referring to the city's NBA team. Mills laughed again, louder this time. Oh, really? The Thunder? And I suppose you're their star player too? I never said I was a star, David replied quietly. I just play for the team. By now, more people in the neighborhood were starting to notice the commotion. Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the house across the street, had come out to water her plants, but she was clearly more interested in watching what was happening with the police car. A jogger had slowed to a walk and was pretending to stretch while keeping an eye on the situation. Mills noticed the growing audience and seemed to enjoy it. You know what I think? He said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I think you're just another young guy who thinks he can cruise through rich neighborhoods like he belongs here. David felt his face burning with embarrassment. Officer, I told you I was visiting my grandmother. You can call Sunset Gardens and ask them. They'll tell you I was there. I'm not calling anybody, Mills said, and I don't appreciate young men like you thinking you can just drive around wherever you want, acting like you own the place. The comment stung because it was so unfair. David had never acted like he owned anything. He had been nothing but polite and respectful. He had answered every question honestly, and he definitely hadn't been cruising around the neighborhood. He had been following his GPS to get back to the main road. Mills continued his inspection of the car, taking his time and making a show of it. He used his flashlight to look under the seats even though it was still daylight. He opened the glove compartment and went through every paper inside. He was clearly hoping to find something, anything, that would justify this stop. Officer, David said carefully, I have practice tonight. Could you please tell me what law I've broken so we can resolve this? Mills spun around to face him. Practice? You still sticking with that basketball story? He shook his head as if David was the most ridiculous person he had ever encountered. "Let me tell you something, son. I've been doing this job since before you were born. I can spot a liar from a mile away." David felt his frustration growing, but he knew he had to stay calm. Getting angry would only make things worse. "I'm not lying, officer. I really do play for the Thunder." "Right," Mills said sarcastically. "And what position do you play?" "Forward," David answered. "Uh-huh. And how much do you make?" David was shocked by the question. "I don't think that's relevant to a traffic stop, officer." Mills stepped closer to David. "I'll decide what's relevant here. You see, young man, this is an expensive neighborhood. The people who live here work hard for their money. They don't appreciate having strangers driving around looking for opportunities." "What kind of opportunities?" David asked, genuinely confused. "Don't play dumb with me," Mills said. "Houses to break into, cars to steal, people to rob." "You think I was born yesterday?" David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Officer, I would never do any of those things. I'm not a criminal. I was just visiting my grandmother." By now, quite a crowd had gathered. The woman with the dog had been joined by two other neighbors. The jogger was still stretching, but he had moved closer. Someone in a car had slowed down to see what was happening. David felt like he was in a fishbowl, with everyone staring at him while this officer treated him like a suspect. Mills seemed to be enjoying the attention. He called for backup on his radio, even though the situation clearly didn't require it. "This is Mills," he said into his radio. "I've got a suspicious individual in the Maple Street area. Could use some assistance." David's heart sank. Backup meant this was going to go on even longer, and it meant more officers were going to see him being treated like a criminal for no reason. "Officer, this is really unnecessary," David said. "I haven't done anything wrong. You've searched me, you've searched my car, and you haven't found anything suspicious. Can't I just go?" Mills ignored him and continued looking through the car. He found David's gym bag in the back seat and pulled it out. Inside were basketball shoes, practice clothes, and some protein bars. Mills examined each item as if it was evidence of a crime. "Basketball shoes," Mills said loudly, holding them up for everyone to see. "Guess that proves you're a professional athlete, right?" He laughed at his own joke, and a couple of the neighbors chuckled along with him. David felt humiliated. These people didn't know him, and their first impression was watching him get searched and mocked by a police officer. They probably thought he really was some kind of criminal who had been caught in their neighborhood. 2 more police cars arrived within minutes. The backup officers got out and approached Mills, who immediately began explaining the situation as if David was a dangerous suspect who had been caught red-handed doing something illegal. "Found this individual, driving suspiciously through the neighborhood," Mills told his colleagues. "Claims he's a professional basketball player, but I'm not buying it. Something's not right here." One of the backup officers, a younger man who looked like he might have been new to the force, glanced at David with what seemed like sympathy, but he didn't say anything to contradict his superior. The other backup officer, a woman who appeared to be about Mills's age, looked skeptical about the whole situation. "What traffic violation did he commit?" she asked. Mills hesitated for a moment. "Suspicious driving behavior. Looked like he was casing the neighborhood." David wanted to speak up and defend himself, but he knew that anything he said would probably just make Mills angrier. So he stood there quietly, watching as more and more people gathered to watch his humiliation. The crowd was getting larger. Someone had apparently posted about the situation on social media, because people were starting to arrive who clearly didn't live in the immediate area. A few teenagers had shown up, along with some adults who looked like they had driven over just to see what was happening. Mills was loving every minute of it. He continued going through David's belongings, making comments about each item he found. When he discovered David's phone charger, he held it up like it was suspicious. When he found a water bottle, he made a joke about David staying hydrated for all his professional basketball games. The whole thing felt like a performance, with Mills as the star and David as the unwilling co-star. David had never felt so powerless in his life. He was being treated like a criminal in front of dozens of strangers, and there was nothing he could do about it. "You know what I think?" Mills said to the crowd as if they were all his friends. "I think we've got ourselves a wannabe here. Probably watches basketball on TV and dreams about being a player. Might even have convinced himself it's true." The comment was so cruel and so far from the truth that David almost couldn't believe it was happening. He was a professional athlete who had worked his entire life to get where he was. He had a contract, teammates, coaches, and fans. He had played in front of thousands of people. And now this officer was treating him like he was delusional. But David knew that saying any of this would just make Mills mock him more. So he stayed quiet and hoped that somehow this nightmare would end soon. The crowd around David and Officer Mills had grown to about 20 people, and more were arriving every few minutes. Someone had clearly posted about the situation on social media, because people were showing up with their phones already out, ready to record whatever was happening. Mills seemed to feed off the attention. He had found his audience and he was going to make the most of it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the crowd, "we have ourselves a real situation here. This young man claims to be a professional basketball player, but I think we all know better than that." A few people in the crowd laughed, and Mills smiled widely. David felt his stomach drop. This was no longer just a traffic stop. It had become some kind of twisted entertainment with him as the main attraction. "Now, I've been protecting this neighborhood for 15 years. Mills continued, gesturing toward the crowd like he was giving a speech. "And I can tell you we don't get many NBA players driving around in beat-up Honda Civics." More laughter from the crowd. David looked down at his car, the car he loved, the car that held so many good memories. Now it was being used as evidence against him, as proof that he couldn't possibly be who he said he was. One of the backup officers, the younger one who had seemed sympathetic earlier, shifted uncomfortably. "Mills," he said quietly, "maybe we should wrap this up." "We haven't found anything suspicious," but Mills waved him off. "Not yet, Johnson. I want to be thorough here. The people of this neighborhood deserve to feel safe." Mills turned back to David, who was still standing with his hands on the car. "So tell me, Mr. Basketball Player, what's your scoring average this season?" David hesitated. He didn't want to engage with this circus, but he also knew that not answering would probably make things worse. "About 12 points per game," he said quietly. Mills burst out laughing. 12 points. Did you hear that, folks? Our NBA superstar here averages 12 whole points per game. He slapped his knee like it was the funniest thing he had ever heard. "I bet my nephew in high school scores more than that." The crowd was eating it up. David could see phones pointed at him from every direction. People were live streaming this humiliation, broadcasting it to who knows how many viewers online. His teammates might see this. His coaches might see this. His grandmother might see this. "And I suppose you make millions of dollars too, right?" Mills continued his performance. "Driving around in a Honda Civic but making millions of dollars. That makes perfect sense." David wanted to explain that not every NBA player made millions, that he was still early in his career, that he chose to drive a modest car because it was practical and meaningful to him, but he knew that any explanation would just give Mills more material to work with. The female backup officer was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Mills, this has gone on long enough. We need to either charge him with something or let him go." Mills turned to her with an annoyed expression. "Officer Rodriguez, I'm conducting a thorough investigation here." This individual was behaving suspiciously in a high-end neighborhood. "We have a responsibility to the citizens." Rodriguez looked like she wanted to say more, but she held her tongue. David could see the conflict in her eyes. She clearly thought this whole thing was wrong, but she wasn't willing to directly challenge her colleague in front of a crowd. Mills had found David's gym bag again and was going through it piece by piece, holding up each item for the crowd to see. "Look at these sneakers," he said, waving David's basketball shoes in the air. "I bet these cost more than my car payment. But somehow our NBA star here can't afford a decent car." Someone in the crowd shouted, "Maybe he spent all his money on shoes," and Mills laughed like it was the most clever comment ever made. David felt tears of frustration building in his eyes, but he blinked them back. He couldn't let these people see him cry. That would just give them more ammunition. He had to stay strong, even though this was the most humiliating experience of his life. Mills found David's practice jersey in the bag. It was a simple gray shirt with the Thunder logo and David's number, but instead of recognizing it as evidence that David was telling the truth, Mills held it up like it was a fake ID. "Oh, look at this," Mills announced to the crowd. "He's got a jersey with a number on it. Must have bought this at the mall, folks. You can get anything printed on a shirt these days." The crowd was getting bigger and more animated. Someone had set up a folding chair, like they were planning to stay for a while. A food truck had even pulled up across the street, apparently hoping to capitalize on the unexpected gathering. David noticed that some people in the crowd were starting to look uncomfortable. A few had put their phones away and were whispering to each other with concerned expressions, but Mills was too caught up in his performance to notice that the mood was starting to shift. "You know what I think happened here?" Mills said, addressing the crowd like he was solving a great mystery. "I think this young man was driving through our neighborhood, seeing how the other half lives, getting ideas about what he might like to take home with him." The accusation was so unfair and so wrong that David finally couldn't stay quiet.
"Officer, that's not true."
"I was visiting my grandmother. I visit her every Tuesday. The staff at Sunset Gardens knows me." Mills spun around to face him. "Did I give you permission to speak?" He shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. "You stand there and keep your mouth shut unless I ask you a direct question." The harshness of Mills' tone seemed to shock even some of his supporters in the crowd. A few people exchanged glances, and David heard someone whisper, "That seems a bit much." But Mills was on a roll now. He had an audience, and he was going to milk it for all it was worth. "This is what happens when people don't know their place," he announced. "They start getting ideas above their station. They start thinking they can go anywhere and do anything." The comment was loaded with implications that made David's skin crawl. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. This was about something much deeper and much uglier. Officer Johnson, the younger backup, stepped forward. "Mills, I really think you should let me do my job." Mills cut him off. "I've got more experience than you and Rodriguez combined. I know how to handle situations like this." Mills turned back to the crowd. "Now I want everyone here to get a good look at what suspicious behavior looks like. This is how criminals case neighborhoods. They drive around slowly, looking for opportunities, trying to blend in." David wanted to scream that he hadn't been casing anything, that he had simply been following his GPS, that he had every right to drive on any public street he wanted, but he knew that speaking up would only make Mills more aggressive. The live streams were getting more viewers by the minute. David could see the numbers on some of the phones pointed at him. Hundreds of people were watching this happen in real time. Soon it would be thousands. The humiliation was spreading beyond this street corner, beyond this neighborhood, beyond this city. Mills found David's protein bars in the gym bag and held them up like they were evidence of a crime. "Look at this, folks. High-end nutrition supplements. I bet these cost $10 each. But remember, this is just a regular guy who drives a Honda Civic." The logic made no sense, but the crowd seemed to go along with it. David realized that most of these people had already made up their minds about him. They had decided he was guilty of something, and now they were just enjoying watching him get punished for it. "Officer," David said as respectfully as he could, "my team is expecting me at practice tonight. Could you please tell me what I'm being charged with so I can call my lawyer?" Mills's eyes lit up at the mention of a lawyer. Oh, now he wants a lawyer? Did you hear that, folks? The innocent man wants a lawyer. He turned to the crowd with a big grin. "In my experience, innocent people don't ask for lawyers." The comment was so wrong that even some people in the crowd looked skeptical. Everyone knew that asking for a lawyer was a basic right, but Mills was beyond caring about rights or procedures now. He was putting on a show and nothing was going to stop him. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, and the live streams were reaching thousands of viewers across the city. Officer Mills was still putting on a show, holding up items from David's gym bag and making jokes about each one. The whole scene had taken on a carnival-like atmosphere, with Mills as the ringmaster and David as the unwilling performer. But then something changed. A teenage boy who had been watching from the back of the crowd suddenly pushed forward, squinting at David's face. The kid looked like he was about 16, wearing a Thunder jersey and carrying a basketball under his arm. He had apparently been walking home from a pickup game when he heard about the commotion and came to see what was happening. "Wait a minute," the teenager said, loud enough for people around him to hear. "Wait just a minute." Mills was in the middle of making another joke about David's protein bars when he heard the interruption. He turned toward the teenager with an annoyed expression. "Son, I'm conducting police business here. Please step back." But the teenager wasn't backing down. He was staring at David with growing recognition. "That's David Williams," he said, his voice getting louder and more excited. "That's David Williams from the Thunder." A murmur went through the crowd. Some people started looking more closely at David, comparing his face to whatever mental image they had of the basketball player. Others pulled out their phones and started searching for pictures. Mills let out an exasperated sigh. "Son, this individual is not a professional basketball player. He's been lying about that this whole time. Now please move along." But the teenager wasn't giving up. "No, I'm serious. I was at the game last week when they played the Lakers. That's definitely him." He held up his phone, which showed a picture of David in his Thunder uniform, mid-dribble during a game. The crowd around the teenager started gathering closer to look at the phone. David could hear people saying things like, "Oh my God," and "That does look like him," and "I think the kid is right." Mills was starting to look uncomfortable for the first time since the stop began, but he wasn't ready to admit he might have made a mistake. "Anyone can find pictures on the internet," he said dismissively. "That doesn't prove anything." The teenager wasn't the only one convinced now. A woman in the crowd had found a video on her phone showing David scoring a three-pointer in a recent game. She held it up for others to see, and the recognition spread through the crowd like wildfire. "That's him," someone said. "That's definitely him." "Oh no," said another person. "We've been watching a police officer harass an NBA player." Officer Rodriguez, the female backup, had pulled out her own phone and was quietly doing a search. When she found what she was looking for, her face went pale. She walked over to Mills and whispered something in his ear, showing him her phone screen. Mills looked at the phone, then at David, then back at the phone. David could see the exact moment when the reality of the situation hit him. The color drained from Mills's face, and his confident demeanor cracked for the first time. But Mills wasn't ready to give up completely. "Even if he is who he says he said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier swagger, "that doesn't mean he wasn't behaving suspiciously." The crowd was having none of it now. People were pulling up more and more evidence on their phones. Game highlights, team photos, news articles about David's community work. The teenager with the basketball had become something of a hero to the crowd, and he was proudly showing everyone the pictures he had taken with David at a charity event the month before. "I got a selfie with him at the children's hospital," the teenager announced to the crowd. "He was there signing autographs for kids with cancer. He's a really good guy." The mood of the crowd had completely shifted. What had started as entertainment at David's expense was now turning into sympathy for him and anger at Officer Mills. People were starting to realize that they had been watching an innocent man get humiliated for no reason. "This is terrible," David heard someone say. "That poor man." "Someone should report this officer," said another voice. Mills could feel the crowd turning against him, and he was starting to panic. Officer Johnson, the younger backup, approached him cautiously. "Mills, we need to end this now. This has gone way too far." But Mills was too proud to back down gracefully. "I was doing my job," he said defensively. "I had every right to investigate suspicious behavior." "What suspicious behavior?" asked the woman who had found the video on her phone. "Driving through a neighborhood? Visiting his grandmother? What exactly was suspicious about that?" Mills couldn't answer the question, because there hadn't been any suspicious behavior. There had only been a young black man driving through an expensive neighborhood, and Mills had made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice. The live streams were going viral now. The viewer counts were climbing into the tens of thousands. Comments were flooding in from people who recognized David, people who were outraged by what they were seeing, people who were demanding that Officer Mills face consequences for his actions. David finally spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Mills, I told you from the beginning that I was visiting my grandmother at Sunset Gardens. I told you I played for the Thunder. Everything I said was true. I have done nothing wrong here." The crowd erupted in agreement. People were shouting things like, "He's right," and "This is wrong," and "Let him go." Mills looked around at the hostile crowd, at his fellow officers who were clearly uncomfortable with the situation, at the phones recording his every move. He realized that his career might be in serious jeopardy. Everything he had done for the past hour had been caught on camera and broadcast to thousands of people. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward and spoke quietly to Mills. "We need to wrap this up right now. Give him back his belongings and let him go. We have no grounds to hold him." Mills knew she was right, but his pride was still getting in the way. "I was conducting a legitimate investigation," he insisted. "Investigation of what?" Johnson asked. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't breaking any laws. You pulled him over because you didn't think he belonged in this neighborhood. That's not legitimate. The teenager with the basketball approached David cautiously. Mr. Williams, I'm really sorry this happened to you. You didn't deserve this. David managed a small smile. Thank you. What's your name? Tyler, the teenager said. I'm a huge fan. I was at the game when you hit that buzzer beater against the Celtics. I remember that shot, David said. It felt good coming off my hand. The brief exchange between David and Tyler was captured on multiple phones, and it showed the stark contrast between David's gracious demeanor and the humiliation he had just endured. Here was a professional athlete, someone who should have been treated with respect, being kind to a young fan even after being publicly embarrassed. Mills finally realized that he had no choice but to end the stop. He handed David back his license and registration without saying a word. His face was red with embarrassment and anger, but he knew that anything else he said would only make things worse. David took his documents and started putting his belongings back in his gym bag. The crowd watched in supportive silence as he gathered the items that Mills had scattered around for his entertainment. Mr. Williams, Tyler said, would it be okay if I got another picture with you, to show that you're okay? David looked at the teenager, then at the crowd of people who had gone from mocking him to supporting him. Sure, Tyler, I'd be happy to. As David and Tyler posed for a selfie, the crowd applauded. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a victory after everything that had happened. David had survived the humiliation with his dignity intact, and now people were seeing him for who he really was. But even as he smiled for the camera, David knew that this experience would stay with him forever. He had been treated like a criminal for visiting his grandmother, and it had all been captured on video for the world to see. The recognition had saved him from further humiliation, but it couldn't undo what had already happened. Officer Mills walked back to his patrol car without another word, followed by the uncomfortable stares of 50 witnesses and thousands of online viewers. His moment of power had become a moment of shame, and everyone present knew that this was far from over. By the time David got home that evening, the videos of his encounter with Officer Mills had exploded across social media. What had started as a few live streams from curious neighbors had become a nationwide conversation about police conduct, racial profiling, and the treatment of citizens during traffic stops. David's phone was buzzing constantly with calls and text messages. His teammates, his coaches, his family and friends from across the country were all reaching out to check on him and express their outrage at what they had seen. The Thunder's public relations team was already working on a statement, and several news outlets were requesting interviews. But David wasn't ready to talk to reporters yet. He was still processing what had happened. He sat in his living room, watching the videos that people had posted online, seeing himself from the perspective of the crowd. It was surreal to watch his own humiliation played back from multiple angles. The comments on the videos were overwhelmingly supportive of David and critical of Officer Mills. People were sharing their own stories of police encounters, expressing their anger at the way David had been treated, and calling for Mills to face consequences. The hashtag #Justice for David was trending nationally. Meanwhile, at the police station, Chief Patricia Chen was having the worst day of her career. She had been in meetings since 6 o'clock, dealing with the fallout from Mills's actions. The mayor had called. The city council had called. The local NAACP chapter had called. And the media requests were pouring in faster than her staff could handle them. Chief Chen had watched the videos herself and she was appalled. In her 25 years in law enforcement, she had never seen such an obvious abuse of power caught so thoroughly on camera. Mills had not only violated department policies, but had also embarrassed the entire force in front of thousands of witnesses. Officer Mills was called into the chief's office at 8 o'clock that night. He walked in trying to maintain some of his earlier swagger, but it was clear that he knew he was in serious trouble. The videos had been viewed millions of times and the story was being covered by national news outlets. "Sit down, Mills," Chief Chen said without looking up from her computer. She was reading the flood of complaints that had been filed against Mills in just the past few hours. Citizens were demanding his firing, his prosecution, and a complete overhaul of the department's training programs. "Chief, I was just doing my job," Mills began, but Chen held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," she said firmly. "I've watched the videos. I've read the witness statements. I've spoken with Officers Rodriguez and Johnson. There is no justification for what you did today. Mills shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The individual was behaving suspiciously in a high-end neighborhood. I had every right to investigate. What suspicious behavior? Chen asked, echoing the question that had been asked by the crowd. Driving to visit his grandmother, following GPS directions, being black in a wealthy neighborhood? Mills's face reddened. I never said anything about race. You didn't have to, Chen replied. Your actions spoke loud enough. You pulled over a citizen who had committed no traffic violations. You searched him without probable cause. You humiliated him in front of a crowd for your own entertainment. And you continued even after it became clear that he was telling the truth about who he was. The chief pulled up one of the videos on her computer and turned the screen toward Mills. Watch this, she ordered. Watch yourself mocking a citizen who had done nothing wrong. Watch yourself turning a traffic stop into a circus. Tell me how any of this serves and protects our community. Mills watched the video with growing discomfort. Seeing himself from the outside, he began to realize how wrong his actions looked. But his pride still wouldn't let him admit complete fault. I made a judgment call based on my experience. Your judgment was wrong, Chen said bluntly. And your experience apparently taught you nothing about treating people with dignity and respect. While Mills was facing consequences at the police station, David was making a decision about how to handle the situation publicly. He could have stayed silent and let the story fade away. He could have demanded Mills be fired and sued the department. Or he could try to turn this negative experience into something positive. David chose the third option. The next morning, David held a press conference at the Thunder's practice facility. He was joined by his coach, the team's general manager, and several of his teammates who wanted to show their support. The room was packed with reporters from local and national news outlets. Yesterday, I experienced something that unfortunately happens to too many people in our community, David began, reading from a prepared statement. I was treated as suspicious and dangerous for the simple act of visiting my grandmother and driving through a neighborhood where I had every right to be. He paused and looked directly into the cameras. But I don't want this to be just another story about police misconduct. I want it to be the beginning of a conversation about how we can do better. David announced that he was partnering with the local community center to organize basketball clinics for young people and police officers to participate in together. The goal would be to build relationships and understanding between law enforcement and the community they serve. Sports have the power to bring people together, David said. When you're on the court with someone, you see them as a person, not as a stereotype. I hope these clinics can help officers see young people like me as individuals with dreams and families and contributions to make. The announcement was met with widespread praise. Community leaders called it a mature and constructive response to an unjust situation. Even some police officers publicly supported the initiative, saying it was exactly the kind of program their departments needed. But not everyone was satisfied with David's approach. Some activists argued that he was being too forgiving, that Officer Mills needed to face real consequences, not just participate in basketball games. They worried that David's gracious response would let the police department off the hook too easily. David understood these concerns, but he believed that building bridges was more important than burning them down. He had experienced racism and abuse of power, but he didn't want to respond with anger and division. He wanted to be part of the solution. Officer Mills, meanwhile, was facing the full consequences of his actions. Chief Chen suspended him without pay pending a full investigation. The district attorney's office announced that they were reviewing the case for possible civil rights violations. And Mills was required to attend sensitivity training and anger management courses before he could even be considered for reinstatement. But perhaps the most significant consequence for Mills was the damage to his reputation and self-image. He had spent 15 years believing he was a good cop protecting his community. Now he was forced to confront the possibility that he had been part of the problem instead of the solution. 3 weeks after the incident, Mills found himself sitting in David's community basketball clinic, watching the young man he had humiliated patiently teaching free throw techniques to a group of kids from the neighborhood. Mills was there as part of his required community service, but he was starting to understand that he needed to be there for his own education as well. David noticed Mills in the corner of the gym and walked over to him during a break in the clinic. "Officer Mills," he said simply, Mills looked up, expecting anger or confrontation. Instead, he saw a young man who looked tired but determined. "Mr. Williams," Mills replied quietly, "I owe you an apology." "Yes, you do," David said. "But more importantly, you owe it to yourself to figure out why you treated me the way you did. And you owe it to every person you encounter as a police officer to do better." Mills nodded, finally beginning to understand the full weight of his actions. "I watched the videos," he said. "I saw myself through other people's eyes. I didn't like what I saw." "Good," David said. "That's the first step toward change." The conversation was brief, but it marked a turning point for both men. David continued his community work, using his platform as a professional athlete to advocate for police reform and community engagement. His basketball clinics became a model for other cities dealing with similar issues. Mills eventually returned to duty after completing his training in community service. He was a different officer than he had been before, more conscious of his biases and more committed to treating every citizen with respect. He never forgot the lesson he learned that day on Maple Street, and he made sure to share that lesson with younger officers who looked up to him. The incident had consequences that rippled far beyond David and Mills. The police department implemented new training, programs focused on implicit bias and community relations. The city council passed new oversight measures to prevent similar incidents, and the conversation about police conduct and racial profiling continued long after the video stopped trending on social media. David's grandmother, Dorothy, watched the news coverage from her room at Sunset Gardens with a mixture of pride and sadness. She was proud of how her grandson had handled such a difficult situation with grace and wisdom. But she was sad that he had to experience such treatment in the first place. "That boy has always been special," she told her friends at the facility. "Even when he was little, he knew how to turn bad situations into good ones. And in the end, that's exactly what David had done. He had taken one of the worst experiences of his life and used it to make his community a little bit better. It didn't erase what had happened to him, but it gave the experience meaning and purpose." The story of David Williams and Officer Mills became more than just another viral video. It became a case study in how individuals can choose to respond to injustice with wisdom instead of anger, how communities can come together to address problems instead of ignoring them, and how even the worst situations can lead to positive change if people are willing to do the hard work of making it happen. David continued to visit his grandmother every Tuesday, driving the same route through the same neighborhood in his beloved Honda Civic. But now he was recognized not as a suspicious stranger, but as a neighbor who had shown his community what grace under pressure really looked like.